Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 100. Yes, episode 100 of the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. Today is going to be a little bit of a potpourri episode. We've got a few different things. There's a reflection on the past. There's the forecasted and the highly anticipated branding change, and a little bit of talk about why we're doing that. There's a shout outs from previous guests. You'll hear from some of the awesome, famous, well-known, intelligent guests we've had on here in the past. And then I asked my listeners for some of their favorite episodes from the past. So we're going to play some of the best clips, some of the very best clips from the best 100 episodes of The Best Interest so far. However, as we start most of our episodes these days, we do have a review of the week. This one comes from LSE 587, who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And LSC said, "I love this podcast. I listen to podcasts at the gym and on walks. Jesse makes the time fly by. He is knowledgeable and very easy to understand. And I've sent him a few questions via email. Not only has he replied back, but he has incorporated my questions into his blog and podcast. Thank you, Jesse." Well, LSE 587, thanks for the kind words. Shoot me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog. We'll get you hooked up with a super soft Best Interest t-shirt. And yes, listeners, as you will hear later today, as you might already be familiar with, I really enjoy, and I'm going to do more and more of these AMA episodes where we get interesting, intricate, sometimes unique or kind of strange questions that you might not have heard before from the world of financial planning. Questions like the ones that LSC 587 sent in, and it makes for such interesting content. I enjoy putting them together. We've gotten great feedback from our listeners on the AMA episodes, and there are certainly a lot more of them to come in the next 100 episodes and far beyond. And as I just alluded to, you will hear various former guests give us some shout outs, say hi in today's episode, and they'll let you know where you can go back and listen to them here on the podcast. Again, a lot of really good episodes in the backlog, and also where you can go check them out on their own channels, because I encourage you guys to go far and wide and deep when it comes to educating yourselves on personal finance, investing, financial planning. And I really think that is the way to eventually formulate your own expert opinions, is by hearing what a lot of other people think, synthesizing it, figuring out how it applies to your own situation, your own life, and boom, there you have your opinions. So let's start off with our first shout out here.
Hey, Jesse, you know what I heard? You have reached 100 episodes. And I know what everybody's thinking, man, if Jesse can do it, then I can do it too. And you know what? You probably can't, because frankly, the average podcast lasts 7 episodes. And the fact that you made it to 100, well, frankly, all of us in the basement, we're high-fiving you. Mom has made a cake, so you got to come back over and hang out with us. I hung out with you on episodes 73 and 93 off the top of my head. I think those were probably the best episodes in the entire catalog of those 100. Don't you think? They probably are. But anyway, congratulations on 100 episodes. Here's to 100 more, big guy. And we'll see you back here in Mom's basement for more Stacking Benjamins fun as well.
Thank you for those kind words, Joe. And now, listeners, let's go on a little bit of a reflection on the journey of the Best Interest podcast and just the best interest in general. And my thought immediately goes back to the Bill Gates quote: "Most people overestimate what we can do in 2 years, but we underestimate what we can do in 10 years. And 10 years ago, 2015, not only was the best interest not on my radar at all, but I wouldn't even say I knew that much about personal finance and investing in the first place. But right about that time is when I got hooked on this content. And I read 20 or 30 books on the topic per year for a few years in that 2016, 2017, 2018 timeline. I obviously must have been a really fun guy to talk to, great at parties with all I would do in my free time was read about money. But then eventually I started offering up my ideas or just what I had learned to my engineering colleagues back in my old career, aerospace engineering. And people would ask me questions about their 401k, or, I was talking about the stuff at the water cooler. Eventually I would write my colleagues emails with these, hopefully clear explanations on my thought process or what I was doing, why I was doing it, what I think they might want to consider. And one of those colleagues said, Jesse, this is basically a blog post. What you've just written me in this email is basically a blog post. So why don't you make a website, a blog, and just share it with the internet? And boom, the best interest was born. The name, of course, coming from Ben Franklin's quote, an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, along with this idea of wanting to, operate in the best interest of my readers and listeners. And then, of course, there's just the triple meaning, if you will, of here we are in this investing world, and whatever we can do to earn the most interest on our money is something we ought to consider. So boom, okay, that's how the name happened, The Best Interest. The Best Interest podcast started in 2021, and that was its own unique journey. First, just learning the logistics of recording and editing and publishing this podcast on my own. Second, getting better at talking into the microphone and talking smoothly. The early episodes, if you don't know, simply aren't that good. I do not encourage you to go back to those early episodes of the podcast. You can go back and listen if you're just curious and you want to see how much it's changed over time. If you start in the early episodes, if that's where you started on this podcast, you might have not have made it to episode 100. I wouldn't blame you for turning the podcast off. And in fact, some of you might not know this. We went back in time about 6 months ago and re-recorded a new intro for episode 1 that simply says, hey, this is an early episode of the podcast. Some of you might have heard of The Best Interest. You decided to go back and start at episode 1 because that's the way you like to do things. And if you did choose that, you're going to realize that episode 1, maybe even the first few dozen episodes, aren't that good. And you probably should just skip ahead to the later episodes anyway. But then there's the journey too of just the content itself and me trying to figure out how I wanted to present these episodes and what I wanted to talk about in these episodes. Whether it was interviews with experts or roundtable discussions or just me going solo on the microphone or Ask Me Anything episodes. Over time, I think I've narrowed in on the episodes that you all enjoy more, just that I'm getting better and better feedback on, episodes that you're learning more from, and also episodes that I enjoy putting together. I think that's an important part of the process too. Now, what's really interesting is that the podcast essentially died at one point. So I said I started in 2021, and I made 37 episodes of the podcast over the first 30 weeks of 2021. And then I got a little bit burnt out. I didn't love the direction that I was taking the podcast in. It was really time consuming. My heart just wasn't into it at that point. And so over the following 11 months, I made one episode. And to anyone on the outside, and even to me living in that moment, the podcast was no longer a living project. I still loved personal finance and investing and financial planning. I still used the blog a lot during that time. I was still writing at least one, sometimes 2 articles per week. And eventually I used the blog to act as my resume to change careers, right? Now I'm working in financial planning, wealth management. So not only was I creating content around these ideas, but I also started helping families implement these ideas daily into their own lives. And by the end of 2022, during the doldrum period of this podcast, when it really wasn't alive anymore, that's when I started looking around and I thought a few different things. First, there are quite a few podcasts out there run by financial planners like me. Some of them are great. Some of them, though, I thought were maybe a bit lacking, or I thought I could do something pretty unique in this space, something that not many other people are doing. And then the more I listened to these podcasts, the more confident I began to feel in my own teaching abilities. We talked about this on episode 92 with Dan Otter, because that episode was all about teachers and 403Bs and what school teachers can be doing differently. That both my parents were school teachers, and I acted as a teaching assistant throughout college. I think, 8 or 10 different college courses on some pretty complex engineering topics. And I always got good feedback on my ability to explain complex topics. And so suddenly the image started to come into focus a little bit more, that I could use this podcast as a teaching platform. I could bring on some experts who can explain their expertise. I could share stories and answers from within the wealth management practice that I work at every single day. Ultimately, a rising tide lifts all ships, right? I think we all do better, that if I'm providing a better product and you all are learning more, everyone's benefiting. And then if I do a good enough job, that good things could happen in my professional life too. So putting that idea into practice, starting at the beginning of 2023, I began working with an outside podcast production team, SimplePod Studios. Shout out to Justin and Kyle, who not only make this podcast just sound better, and they save me tons of time on the editing and production side, but we had a simple experimental goal together of let's try to publish 26 episodes every other week in 2023. every episode on time. We can figure out the content itself. Why am I here? What am I talking about? Et cetera, et cetera. And not only did we hit that goal, but then we kept the momentum rolling into 2024 and now here into 2025. So episode 44 of this podcast and onward has a new level of quality to it. And sure enough, with that consistency and that quality and that new vision for the podcast, a lot of you listeners have jumped on the bandwagon and followed along. 2 years ago, when we started on this new version of the podcast, I'll call it, I'd be lucky if 500 people tuned in every month. Well, that number is compounding every single month. Right now, we're on pace as I sit here and record in January. We're probably going to eclipse 7,500 listeners this month. Probably by the end of this year, we'll easily eclipse 10,000 listeners every month. For all I know, that'll happen this spring. And yes, the professional benefits are occurring too. Now, I won't rehash all the details I discussed in episode 96 when it comes to the overlap of my professional wealth management practice and the podcast. But the summary is that some of you listening are reaching out to me for professional help. Some of you listening are referring in your friends and your family to me for professional help. And when it's a good fit, which certainly doesn't happen every time, I know that. But when it's a good fit, when I know that myself and my colleagues here can deliver the financial planning and investing answers to you, to your important questions, then yeah, we end up working together. And you get trusted advice and I get to do my job. And again, a rising tide lifts all ships. Back in 2015, 10 years ago, none of this was even a twinkle in my eye. Back in December 2018, when I wrote the first blog post on the best interest, none of this was on my mind. In February 2021, when I made the very first podcast episode, I had no idea I even wanted to change careers. So I suppose my big takeaway here combines, the Nike idea of just do it with the Bill Gates idea of most people underestimate what they can accomplish in 10 years. And then I sprinkle in a little bit of Bilbo Baggins and J.R. Tolkien from The Lord of the Rings or from The Hobbit, where he says, it's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you'll be swept off to. So this project swept me off to here, and who knows where it's going to sweep me off to next. But mostly, thank you all for listening. On a weekly basis, it feels like I get to express my gratitude to one of you who writes in with something heartfelt. I'll say something similar here, which is that there's nothing quite so energizing as your emails, as your gratitude for my work, your awesome podcast reviews, whatever it may be. It truly is one of the most unique feelings and one of the most unique fuels that keeps me going here on this project. I got this note over the holidays, the 2024 holiday season, and I just wanted to share it with you. So here it goes. Hi, Jesse. I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the work you do with the best interest. I always thought of myself as someone who was bad with finances. I was raised by a single mother who did not have much money, and growing up, we were constantly being told we didn't have enough. My mom has not had a full-time job in years. She has a lot of credit card debt. I know this has had a huge influence on how I view money and finances and why money makes me so incredibly anxious. For the longest time, I've basically ignored it and avoided dealing with my finances because of this anxiety. Recently, my therapist and I have done a lot of work on the idea that gathering information and education myself about things that make me anxious is actually the best way to alleviate this anxiety. For the past few months, I've been working hard on doing this with my personal finances and money. I started by listening to the How to Money podcast, and that's how I found you and the best interest. I've been listening to your podcast and reading your blog ever since, and it has been by far the most helpful resource for me. You are a great teacher, and you have simplified so many things that I thought I would never understand. I love that you always discuss such relevant and relatable topics and do it in a way that is helpful for the average person trying to learn the basics of personal finance. You have no idea how much your blog and podcast have taught me and helped me face my personal finance fears. Your education and work have made me feel so empowered and have alleviated a lot of my anxiety. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your work and commitment to teaching and sharing your knowledge. Thank you so much. I look forward to continuing to learn from you. So that, listeners, I'm not sure how to describe how that note makes me feel. How good it makes me feel that this note represents listeners like you, and that my little waves in the ocean are not only reaching your shores, but carrying an important message that helps you in your lives. And speaking of that, I find it so cool that I can say this very sentence one time, and that through modern technology, it will reach thousands and thousands of you at your own pace, through your speakers, through your headphones, as you drive to work, as you walk your dog, or cook that meal, literally all over the world. It is awesome. So from the bottom of my heart, Thank you for joining me on this journey.
Hey, this is Brad Barrett. You can hear me and Jesse back on episode 54 of the Best Interest podcast. And you can learn more about the life-changing power of financial independence by listening to my podcast, Choose FI. That's choose, like make a choice, FI for financial independence.
Hey everyone, this is Nick Majuli. You can hear Jesse and I back on episode 60 of the Best Interest podcast. And you can check out more of my work at ofdollarsandata.com. Thank you.
All right. So now I want to talk about a minor or maybe a major, maybe a really important rebranding of this podcast. Because on one hand, I love the name The Best Interest. And I know that's how many of you know of this podcast, right? You know the name well, you share it with other people. The brand has done its job and it's stuck out with you. But someone I really admire in the podcasting world said something interesting to me 6 months ago or so. They said, Jesse, I think your content is as good as anyone out there with a finance or investing podcast. It's just a matter of making sure that more people actually have the opportunity to listen to your podcast. And on that front, listeners, here's a little bit of inside baseball knowledge, maybe something you didn't necessarily sign up for to learn. But when the title of a podcast doesn't do enough to describe the content of the podcast, it can turn a lot of listeners away, or people they don't feel the need to tune in the first place. And now just a few minutes ago, kind of coincidentally, you heard in that one listener email to me, she first heard of me on an episode of the podcast, How to Money. Now, what a great example. You know, the How to Money guys, Matt and Joel, they have an awesome podcast. But when you hear a podcast that's titled How to Money, what do you think that is about? That is an amazingly descriptive title for their personal finance content. It matches the content perfectly. Now, The Best Interest, it's a great name. I really like the name, but only after you've discovered what the podcast is about, after I make you aware of the double meanings of the cutesy language there. And I was introduced a couple months ago to a podcast marketing expert, and he said that The Best Interest is the perfect example of what he calls a too cute title. It's cute, it's nice, but only after you understand what the podcast is actually about. If you're an outsider looking in and you just saw that title, The Best Interest, I'm not sure if you'd know what it was about. I mean, maybe you all listening, because you are investing people, maybe you'd make the connection to, the fiduciary standard, the best interest of a client. Maybe you'd make the connection to Benjamin Franklin's quote, but maybe not. Like if you were an attorney, for example, if you actually Google The Best Interest right now, a lot of the top results have to do with, in family courts, the best interest of the child, of a decision being made in the best interest of the child, right? My point is, The Best Interest is not an extremely descriptive title for what this content, what we talk about, is actually about. So instead, that's what I needed to find, a podcast title that could be very descriptive of what we actually talk about here. And ideally, that means that the title is also very searchable in podcast players, on Google, stuff like that. And so for all those reasons, the podcast title moving forward is going to be less flashy, but much more descriptive. It's going to be Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Now, doesn't that neatly encapsulate what we talk about here? And now, okay, it's not as cute as the Best Interest podcast, but Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I know it'll take a little while for us to get the best interest out of all our brains, mostly my own. And so conveniently, I can keep The Best Interest on as an official subtitle of the podcast, if you will. So it'll still remain searchable in that way. When you see this on your podcast players, you're going to start seeing it as Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, The Best Interest. Okay, it'll show up there. Eventually, I'll probably drop that subtitle because I hope there comes a point when more people know of this as Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors than know of it as The Best Interest. Now, it's a little bit nerve-wracking for sure. It might be a little bit like renaming your child, but I know that in a few months or a year or two, I'll look back at this moment in time. I'll look back at this particular name change, and I know that it will be the right move. The Best Interest podcast got me here. It'll always be close to my heart. But yes, starting with today's outro, you will hear our new name, Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Hey, Best Interest listeners, this is Justin Peters. You can hear Jesse and I debate the golden rules of personal finance back on episode 78 of the Best Interest podcast. If you're looking for more personal finance content, check out my podcast, The Struggle is Real, on your favorite podcast player.
with the rebranding behind us, I want to recap some of the very best clips, some of the highlights from the first 100 episodes of the Best Interest podcast. Oh, sorry, from Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. See? I need to start using the right title. I'll allow it for now. Long story short, I reached out to my newsletter subscribers in planning for this episode and asked them for their favorite episodes and clips from podcast history. And the top answers were relatively uniform. It was pretty easy to pick out the top 3. So first, we're going to go back to episode 70 with Jeremy Schneider from Personal Finance Club, who talked about the 7 sins of investing.
Hello, millionaires and future millionaires. This is Jeremy Schneider. You can hear Jesse and I back on episode 70 of the Best Interest podcast. And you can find my fun daily personal finance infographics on Instagram at Personal Finance Club.
I saw a really cool post of yours. It caught my eye because you called it the 7 sins of investing. What are those sins, Jeremy?
The 7 sins of investing. So I've been helping people learn about investing for a long time, and it's really simple at its core. Spend less than you make, invest, buy and hold index funds for a long period of time. But I always see people making these 7 mistakes, and let's go through them quickly. Sin number 1 is holding cash in a retirement account. And I made a post once that said, my nightmares are fueled by young investors holding cash in retirement accounts, because it's this insanely common and insanely devastating mistake, which is you open up a Roth IRA, you put a bunch of money in, you like put your hands over your head, say, I have a Roth IRA, I put money in, I've done it, I win. And a few years go by and you look in your Roth IRA and you put in $5,000, you check it again, and there's like $5,002 in there. And you're like, what's this? I thought this was supposed to grow. And what happened is when you put money into a retirement account or any investment account, it's just cash sitting there. You have to take a second step, which is to actually take that cash and purchase something with it, like an index fund. And so if you ever look inside of your investment accounts and you see any words like cash, sweep, core, default, money market, anything that, and it is a little bit confusing because they can use a bunch of different words to mean the same thing, but anything that sounds like cash, if you see any amount of money sitting there over like $1, then you should be investing that. You should take that money and go buy your fund. So that's sin number 1. Sin number 2 is picking individual stocks. Actually, I don't know if this one kind of pains me, because I think choosing individual stocks has a benefit, which is it's enticing. It encourages people into...
Gets people involved.
Right. And it's relatable. Oh, Home Depot's, I go there all the time, I should buy stock in their company. It's almost a little bit nostalgic. Like that's what our grandparents did. They owned 10 shares of Sears Roebuck, and they sold it 50 years later. I consider it to be a sin because it basically opens you up to risk of these companies going out of business without higher expected returns. Since we can't know ahead of time which stocks are going to do better, when you're picking individual stocks, you're adding risk without getting higher expected returns, and that's a bad deal in investing. What's your take on individual stocks?
Yeah, it's similar. I think for the average person, you are exposing yourself to more errors than you would ever expose yourself to if you are owning an index fund, quite simply. Do I think that if you want to have a little bit of fun and you want to take 1% of your money and buy Berkshire Hathaway because you like Warren Buffett? I get it. I'm not going to tell you that that's the optimal investing decision, but I can understand that. But I think the average scenarios that you and I hear, Jeremy, are the ones where people say, yeah, I've got a diversified portfolio. I'm 1/3 Apple, 1/3 Tesla, 1/3 NVIDIA.
All huge US tech companies. That's
correct.
Those are all very similar.
That's the scary scenario. And it's also a little scary. I see on your Instagram post for this sin number 2, one of the companies that you highlight out of maybe 10 is my beloved Kodak here in Rochester, New York. Poor Kodak. It used to be the lifeblood of our community, had 80,000 local employees out of a city. I mean, the population of Rochester is 250 in the city itself, 250,000, about 1 million when you do the whole metro area. So if you think of 1 million local citizens, 80,000 of them worked at Kodak in about 1990. That's 30 years ago. Yeah. Today it's 1,500.
Wow.
So in 30 years, Kodak went from 80,000 employees to 1,500, and the businesses, essentially went out of business. Stock owners who, if they held the whole time, lost all of their money.
Right.
That is one of the risks you run owning an individual stock.
And if we took ourselves back to like 1995 or something, you would have every reason to think Kodak would continue to crush it for decades to come. People have been taking more photos every single year. Photos are becoming cheaper. Population's growing. You could make like 50 arguments why Kodak was going to continue growing. But the unexpected thing happens, right? Digital photography comes out, Kodak doesn't adapt, whatever. And if you look at the biggest companies of the 90s, we might see names like IBM, Sears, General Motors, General Electric. And, these all didn't go as poorly as Kodak did, but they're not in the top 10 anymore, right?
Right.
And so when you're picking individual stocks based on how they've done, in fact, this leads us very nicely into sin number 3. Sin number 3 is don't chase past performance, or I guess the sin would be chasing past performance. Because if you looked at Kodak stock in 1995 and said, oh my gosh, this stock has been crushing it for 15 years, I want the stock that crushes it, so I'm going to buy Kodak. When you look backwards and buy what just did well, you're missing what's about to do well. And so today you could make a similar argument. The biggest companies in the US, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Tesla, these are superstars today. But if we fast forward 20 years, are they going to still all be in the top 10? I can almost guarantee that they all won't be in this top 10. Maybe 1 or 2 will. We don't know the future. But when you're just looking at what just recently did well, you're missing out on that new startup. You're missing out on, in the 90s, we were buying Kodak, but we weren't buying Netflix or something, the unexpected thing that's going to do really well. And so don't buy your investments based on what did well in the past. Buy broad index funds based on what will do well, what we, to guarantee ourselves that we're going to own whatever happens to do well going forward. And I agree with what you said earlier, by the way, which is, I actually have a 10% rule. With 90% of your portfolio, buy and hold index funds. But with 10%, go nuts. If you want to buy individual stocks, you want to buy some crypto, you want to buy some ETFs, whatever, go for it. And when I say ETFs, I mean, like actively managed or narrow sector ETFs. ETFs are fantastic to buy for their low cost and broad nature of the index fund versions. But yeah, don't be speculating with your whole portfolio, because if you're constantly buying what just did well, you're going to miss what's about to do well.
Yeah. John Bogle famously said, actually not famously said, I think it's one of his lesser known quotes, but there's an excellent speech/essay he did about it. The quote is, the iron rule of investing is reversion to the mean. It always rears its head, reversion to the mean. That which is high will eventually come back to average. That which is low will eventually come back to average. And he's essentially restating your sin number 3 there, Jeremy. What is sin number 4?
Yeah, on that reversion to the mean, right now, everyone hates international stocks. Everyone's like, why would you buy international? Right. S&P 500, tech stocks, that's the way, that's what's doing great. But I'm like, it's really hard for me to push this narrative. It's not popular. But personally, with my money, I have like 35 to 40% of my portfolio in non-US stocks. And yeah, they've done poorly the last 10 years. But is the next 10 years going to look like the last 10? Probably not. And like you said, reversion to the mean. It's hard to give you a very compelling argument that like the US market's not going to do well and international markets are going to do well. But I kind of think maybe international markets are underpriced. Maybe there's a little bit too much speculation built into the US tech stocks. And fast forward 10 years, international markets have been averaging 12% a year while US has been averaging 7%. Suddenly, I look pretty smart for buying international. All right. Sorry, I'm long-winded. I love talking about investing. So number 4 is timing the market. Everyone, kind of just like what I was talking about, everyone loves to guess what's about to happen. And right now is no better example. In fact, 2023 is a great example, which is at the beginning of 2023, you could find endless headlines about the gloom and doom coming to the economy. Inflation, recession, the market's crashing. We had a bad 2022, blah, blah. Meanwhile, the market's up, I think like 16% or something this year. And so people were moving their money into cash. Like, ooh, high yield savings accounts are paying 4%. I'm going to get my 4%. If you put your money into a high yield savings account in 2023 and got 4%, and the year's not even over, so maybe you're at like 3% so far, you underperformed the market to date by like 14%. Like underperforming by 14% is devastating. And that's right. And that's what timing the market can do. And so timing the market is any sort of decision based on what you think is going to happen or what is happening. Move my money in, move my money out, move to bonds, move to stocks, move this, move that. And it's a really tough pill for an investor to swallow, that you kind of need to ignore all that. It seems like, and again, I kind of go back to human evolution. We're designed as humans to react to stimulus. If we hear a twig break in the jungle, a tiger might be looming and we should run. But if we hear a scary stock headline, we shouldn't pull our money. In fact, like you said, probably the opposite. As everyone else is running out, we should probably be running in. And so you kind of have to ignore that noise. Don't time the market.
Right. Don't do something. Just stand there. Another John Bogle quote. And another shameless plug, only because I literally published it this morning, an article about a terrific real life stock lesson from just the last 2 weeks that the real world stock market provided us against trying to time the market. A lesson of just zoom out and wait for things to happen, simply because the market was down something like 10% from the end of July through the end of October. Now, down 10% in 3 months doesn't feel good. Nobody's having fun. And it would be very human to say, I'm sick of this. I'm going to cross my fingers, sell.
Just wait it out. Wait till the market recovers before I put my money. It makes perfect sense on the face of it.
And little would that investor have known that the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, the chairman, was about to come out and say, yeah, we think we're done with interest rate hikes. And the market popped for 6% in 1 week. Well, if you sat out that week because you were just sick of it, missing 6% is not as bad as the example that you gave of underperforming by 13%, but 6% sucks if that's what you missed out on.
Right. Yeah. If you're waiting for the market to recover, you'll miss it. You have to be investing when it's down. That's when you want to be buying, when it's down. And that's a great example.
Hey, what's going on? This is Doug Cunnington, and you could hear Jesse and I back on episode number 72. You could hear more of my ramblings over at the Mile High 5 podcast.
What's the number 5, Jeremy?
So number 5 is paying high fees. And you and I, we live in the world of financial educated people. But in the real world, if you walk into any town USA and ask people what they're doing, oftentimes they are investing via some sort of high fee mutual fund or advisor or 401k or and if you walk into like a strip mall financial advisor anywhere in the US, they will put you into some real crappy products with real high fees. They won't fully or correctly disclose any of that. And it's very hard for you to even know without kind of really looking hard into where your money is going. And so just as an example, if you pay a 2% annual fee, and some advisors will be like, that's really high, but I see 4% annual fees. I see 5 and 6%. Loads on purchases. And, it's very easy to find people who are in this range of a 2% annual fee. A 2% annual fee over the course of a 40-year investing career cuts your investment about in half. So if you would have had $2 million, you'd have $1 million just for that fee that you're paying that advisor. And a lot of people will say, I don't want to do it myself. I don't want to figure it out. It's not worth $1 million to you, like the few hours it's going to take to open an account and put the money in yourself. I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss the value of an advisor, but you should at least understand the impact of the fees, because there may be no more valuable 3 hours of your life, financially speaking, than looking into your fees and figuring out if you can minimize them.
Totally. And something I've learned in my doing this, Jeremy, the best interest working with clients as well, is there's such a wide range of quote unquote advice and advising. And it absolutely behooves anybody out there, if you're considering getting professional financial help, know what you're paying for and know what you're paying. Because some of the cases I've seen before, you're talking about mutual funds with 1+%, advisors charging commissions to sell them, getting 5 to 6% load fees upfront. And then what does the client get out of that? A 30-minute phone call once a year.
Right.
So you're talking about
from someone whose incentive is to sell, not to provide advice.
Correct. So you're talking, if someone has a $500,000 account in that case, they might be paying $10,000 a year plus 5% anytime they make any trades in exchange for 30 minutes of advice. And talk about a raw deal. Yeah. So I hear you. There's some nasty stuff out there. So everybody know what your fees are and know what you're getting for them. See if it's worthwhile. We've got to think long term, Jeremy, and that brings us to sin number 6.
That's right. Sin number 6 is thinking short term. We all know people like this who are trying to get rich quick or live for the weekend. Or I just constantly hear from people who are, I give them this pitch. I'm like, hey, a few $100 a month, spend less than you make, throw it in the next fund, leave it there, don't touch it, minimize fees, let it go. They're like, no, bro, I don't want to be rich when I'm old. I'm like, you want to be broke when you're old? Because you're going to be. And so I think, they're like, no, I'm going to, Dogecoin is the future, or no, I'm going to put it all on Tesla, or, I literally talked to someone the other day who had $500,000 and didn't want to get rich the slow way. $500,000, you put an index fund, doubles every 7 years. 7 years, that's 1 million. 14 years, that's 2 million. 21 years, that's 4 million. So 21 years, they'd have $4 million. That's insane, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead, they they chased past performance, they picked stocks, they committed all the sins, right? They committed every sin. Thought short term, how can I turn this 500,000 to $1 million in a year? And that 500,000 became 100,000. They lost 80% of the value. And they asked me, like, how do I get it back? I'm like, if I knew how to 5x money overnight, I'd be doing that all day.
Right, right.
Like, and you thought you did, and you learned the hard way you didn't, because you did it with all your money. If you wanted to do 10%, sure. If they took 10%, 50,000, and turned that 50,000 to 5,000, then that would have sucked. They'd still have 450,000 growing with the market over time. Don't try to get rich quick. And if you do, keep it to a very small portion of your portfolio.
Right. And that example there, 500,000 down to 100,000, based on the fact that they were coming to you with that story, it sounds like they suffered the permanent impairment of capital, which is something that Warren Buffett would say is the number one biggest risk that investors can face. And it's something that investing in a diversified index fund, you completely negate that risk, save for one potential exception. If you invest in an index fund and an asteroid hits the world and destroys the global economy, you have permanently impaired your capital.
That's true.
Short of that example, the natural diversification of an index fund will prevent that fate from occurring. And that's, talk about a terrible fate. I mean, going from 500,000 to 100,000, essentially your portfolio will be limping for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And then they asked me, should I keep doing this to win it back? It's almost like turns into like gamblers mentality, which is right. I can just win it back. But we all know how that turns out for gamblers. They just lose more, they go into debt, and then you have to hit rock bottom. Like, my advice was like, take your 100,000, throw it in an index fund. You just spent $400,000 on education. It was an expensive lesson, but better than lose 100,000, then you lost all, better than going to debt trying to win back, right? So it's a tough pill to swallow, though.
Right. So our listeners, they're not going to commit that sin. They are going to be slow and steady investors. They're also not going to commit sin number 7, which is?
It is the most deadly sin. Maybe, I said 1 was maybe the worst, but this one's even worse than number 1. Sin number 7 is not investing early and often. And I kind of gave you an example earlier in the show where I said, if you invest $250 a year for 10 years, you have like $3,000 because you didn't invest very often. You only invested for 10 years. That's enough. But if you invest $250 for 40 years, you'll have never done worse than $1 million. And so everything else we talked about, the fees, the performance, the stock picking, everything, all the other sins, they are irrelevant if you're not putting money in. If you're the optimal, perfect investor, every fee, every tax break, everything right, and then you're putting in $100 a year, doesn't matter. You might as well not even do it almost, But if you are just a mediocre investor and you're picking some random stocks and some random mutual funds and getting some random taxes on them, but you're putting in $1,000 a month, you're going to be extremely wealthy. And so I think some people get so academic about it, they forget what matters most, which is just how much money you put in. That's how you get rich.
Hey, Best Interest listeners, this is Joel Arsgaard from the How to Money podcast. You can hear Jesse and I back on episode 59 of the Best Interest podcast. Massive congrats to one of the best fellas in the personal finance podcasting space. Jesse, here's to hundreds of more killer episodes to come, my friend.
Okay, always good to hear Jeremy and what he has to say. Now for our second clip, this one goes back to a more recent episode 96, which I hope will go down as an all-timer, as an evergreen episode that really covers 2 important ideas. The first one is why we lean towards indexing in the first place. And, not just because everyone says so, I mean, that's one thing, but I really wanted to open up the hood and explain to you the actual rationale, the logic for indexing or diversifying at the very least, as opposed to trying to pick a winning stock or as opposed to hoping that someone can pick a winning stock for you. And the other thing we talked about in episode 96 is the idea behind timing the market. right? Why timing the market tends to be so hard. Again, not just because everyone says so. I know there are a lot of sayings out there, right? Time in the market versus timing the market. That's great. That's fine. But why? Can we explain why it makes sense to try to not time the market? So, inspired by a terrific listener question, we recorded episode 96. And now I want to play to you one of the best clips from that episode.
Hey, money nerds. This is Paula from Afford Anything. You can hear Jesse and I back on episode 75 and learn more about strategic splurging over at affordanything.com, where we believe in saying yes to the best and no to the rest. Because your wallet can handle anything, but just not all at once.
I want to explain the concepts around timing the market. This explanation will include little sidebars like lump sum investing, dollar cost averaging, the PE ratio or the CAPE ratio. So going back to Lynn's original question, it makes so much sense, right? With the market at all-time highs right now, like it is here on December 12th of 2024, why is right now a good time to invest, right? Surely we should be buying low and selling high, but you want me to buy high? You want me to buy at an all-time high? Okay. First, I want to explain the CAPE ratio. CAPE, cyclically adjusted price to earnings. It's very much related to the price to earnings ratio, which I think we touched on before. It's a way of measuring what stocks are selling for, their price, against how well those companies are doing financially, their earnings. And the CAPE ratio is smoothed out over time to account for inflation. That's the cyclically adjusted part of it, CAPE, cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio. Now, logically speaking, Lynn has a pretty good point here. We know that the S&P 500 price is at an all-time high. And we know that price is one of the great equalizers in determining if an investment is good or not, right? Our Honda Civic example or the hamburger example. Are burgers good? Yeah, hamburgers are good. Would I pay $100 for a hamburger? No, I wouldn't. Price matters, okay? Quality is one thing, but price is important too. Historically, the S&P 500 CAPE ratio oscillates between 10 and 25. And generally, though not always, the lower the PE, the better the forward-looking investment opportunity. That makes intuitive sense, or at least I think it should. The lower the price that I'm purchasing my investment, the better my long-term returns will be. But does that mean that we should avoid investing in any sort of stock market altogether simply because the PE, the price to earnings, or the CAPE ratio is high? The answer there is no, not really. Just because the CAPE ratio is high, it still might be smart to invest. And we're going to link something in the show notes, an article I wrote called Timing the Future Market, CAPE versus Future Returns. And in that article, you'll see some pretty interesting graphs that I put together where we could point to plenty of times where the CAPE ratio was 25 or 30, very much on the high end, and the future inflation-adjusted 10-year returns or 20 or 30-year returns were a perfectly normal and acceptable 5, 6, 7, 8%. Just because the CAPE ratio is high, there is no golden rule stating that you must avoid investing. For reference, right now, as of this recording, the CAPE ratio is at 38, which is very, very high by historical standards. And again, going back to Lynn's point, if I'm paying a very, very high price for the stock market compared to historical standards, surely that can't be a good thing. Surely I must be spending $100,000 on a Honda Civic right now. Well, I hear you, Lynn. Now, the CAPE ratio hasn't been below 25 since the year 2014. And that has some people seriously concerned. Are we in this massive 10-year bubble of high valuations? And at some point, is that bubble going to pop? Maybe. I might not know enough to have an answer to that question. But I do know the counter argument here. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to try to lay it out simply. 100 years ago, the American economy was pretty hands-on. Manufacturing, production, factories, buildings, stuff that is expensive to make and expensive to scale. Meaning, if let's say Ford wanted to double its car creation capacity, it had to buy new land and build new factories and train new people and put in new assembly lines. And all of that is really expensive for a company to do. And it ultimately eats into that company's earnings and growth. In other words, it was really hard for those kind of companies to rapidly expand their profit margins. But today, many of our biggest companies work much differently than that. If Microsoft wants to sell 20% more Office licenses, they don't need any additional capital overhead to do so. They just sell more licenses. Many companies in today's digital age, they work the same or at least very similar ways to Microsoft, right? They don't have these massive capital requirements to grow like the ones that existed 30 or 50 or 100 years ago. And as such, those companies can grow their earnings much faster than historical standards. And if that's true, maybe I am perfectly okay to pay a 38 times CAPE ratio today, because I believe the earnings portion of that equation is likely to rapidly increase in the coming years, turning today's price into quite the bargain. The point being that while the CAPE ratio or the PE ratio is generally helpful, it's not necessarily smart to believe that the PE ratios of the 1950s ought to instruct how we invest today. And then going back to the main point of today, just because a PE ratio is high, we can still have strong long-term future returns going forward. It's hard to time the stock market based on PE ratio alone. Instead, there are a couple simple, tried and true techniques when it comes to investing your money into the stock market. Probably some things that you might have heard of before. To start, I want to tell you a story from 2022, which was in the middle of a bad year for both stocks and bonds. And those kind of bear markets, they make you question, should I just wait for the bottom before I invest? And reader of the blog, Paulson, he wrote in during that year and he said, Jesse, I'm not tempted to sell anything in my 401k or Roth IRA, but I don't know why I should continue buying, at least not at this point with the market doing what it's doing. It's not going up anytime soon. Can I contribute money to those accounts as cash and then wait to invest once the market hits its bottom? It was a great question. And yeah, you could try, Paulson. That's what I responded to him, but I don't think he should. And there are a few reasons why, and these reasons apply to you listening today. Because timing the market in the way that Paulson suggested, first, it barely affects your future portfolio. Second, it's really hard to execute well. And third, it makes your life demonstrably worse along the way.
Hey there, friends. This is Andy Hill. You can hear Jesse and I back on episodes 66 and 84 of the Best Interest podcast. Feeling very grateful that Jesse asked me back twice. And you can check out more family financial independence tips over at my podcast, Marriage, Kids, and Money, and on our website, marriagekidsandmoney.com.
So here's a story of 3 hypothetical fictional investors. Mostly, they're identical investors. We've got normal Nick, we've got good timing Gary, we have bad timing Bill. Normal Nick, good timing Gary, bad timing Bill. All 3 investors started their investing in 1985 when they were 22 years old. They're now 59 and they're approaching retirement. And some other facts about them. All 3 of them use the S&P 500 index funds for their stock investments. All 3 invested $200 a month in 1985 and then increased their contributions by 5% per year until today. So now they invest around $1,200 a month, and all 3 invest via dollar cost averaging. We'll dive into that term in a couple minutes. The point being is they invest whether the markets are high, they invest whether the markets are low, and they buy in between as well. Except for one time. Now, during the great financial crisis that threw a small wrench into their plans, Nick, normal Nick, well, he stayed the course and continued his monthly contributions, but Bill and Gary, they wanted to try something different. Good timing Gary, with his good timing, he managed to time the market perfectly. He stopped investing, just like Paulson wants to with the question that inspired this article. Gary stopped investing at the market top in 2007. He saved all his cash. He then perfectly timed the market bottom in March of 2009, deploying all of his cash into the stock market. So he timed the market to perfection twice. He stopped investing at the perfect top, and then he began investing again at the perfect bottom. Bad timing Bill also timed the market top with Gary, but when the true bottom hit in March 2009, Bill was convinced that there was more room to drop. So as the market recovered, Bill waited and waited and waited. He thought a new bottom would eventually come, so he didn't deploy his cash until 2013 when the market price had fully recovered to 2007 levels and his wise wife screamed at him to get back into the market. Now, fast forward, I wrote this article in 2022. How different were Nick's and Gary's and Bill's portfolio at that point? Well, Gary was best. After all, he timed the market perfectly twice, and he had $1.46 million. Bill was worst. After all, he missed many buying opportunities for about 5 years, but he had $1.38 million, and then Nick was right in the middle at $1.42 million. So again, Gary with the best perfect timing, 1.46, Bill with the worst, 1.38, and Nick in the middle at 1.42. The perfect market timing around 2008, which was a huge crisis, right? That got Gary a 3% edge over normal Nick. And Bill messed up big time, yet Gary only has a 6% edge over him. In the long run, Gary's perfect market timing wasn't actually that important. Now, notably though, Bill and Gary, when they chose to time the market, they didn't sell any of their old investments. All they did was choose not to buy new investments. If they had sold their old investments, though, and then rebought later, our conclusion would be much different. Bill would have lost another 20% of his total portfolio as of today, despite perfectly timing the market top. Okay? He sold at the perfect time, but because he didn't buy back in until it was 3 or 4 years too late, his portfolio would be down about 20% today. And Gary, who was perfect twice at the top, at the bottom, his portfolio would be about 50% higher today. So it just goes to show, if you're only perfect once with market timing, you could be down 20% like bad timing Bill. You have to be perfect twice like Gary to actually be up a large amount. And that begs a question, do you feel that lucky? Personally, I like where normal Nick is at. He didn't worry at all about timing the market, 0 skill, 0 luck, and also 0 stress. He just kept on buying, and he's in a great place. This is a scenario where the juice simply isn't worth the squeeze. The squeeze, again, is double perfection. You have to be right twice. If you manage to be right the first time, ceasing your buys before the market bottom, you'll likely be plagued by bad timing Bill's issue. When the market is at peak pessimism, right? When the market is truly at the bottom, that's peak pessimism. Do you have the skill and the knowledge and the balls of steel to deploy your money into that market? Or are you a dumb would-be market timer like the rest of us are? And then what's the juice you get for that squeeze? Well, it's a 3% boost on your final portfolio. Or maybe this time will be different. Maybe you'll get a 5 or a 6 or a 7% boost on your final portfolio. And while your money is out of the market, sitting on the sidelines, what will you be thinking? Are you just going to be chilled out and relaxed with ice in your veins? Or are you going to be a nervous wreck, worried about when to get back into the market? Not only can this squeeze cost you money, but its psychological cost is unavoidable. Gary, sure, he gained 3%, but he also gained some white hair. He was out of the market for 18 months. 18 months is a really long time. Are you willing to wait 6, 12, 18, 24 months or more for a bear market to end? Now, personally, I'm not trying to time the market over that period of time. I don't want to sit on my thumbs and hope that I time it perfectly. Who knows how long it'll take for us to return to all-time highs when the next bear market hits. I don't want to test my skill with timing the market. I don't want to test my blood pressure by staying out of the market. So that story introduces an idea, dollar cost averaging. Many of us are doing it without even realizing it. That term, interestingly, it kind of has 2 definitions, though they're somewhat related. The first definition of dollar cost averaging is to make a series of investing contributions on regular intervals, such as the way that many of us might contribute to our 401k accounts. Every 2 weeks, $500 comes out of my paycheck into my 401k, and it's invested into a target date fund. That's dollar cost averaging. Now, the second definition, though, it involves starting with a large sum of money and then making the decision to deploy that money into an investment over a specific period of time. Now, that, in my opinion, is a great idea for Lynn to consider today. Rather than dumping 100% of her new investable money into the S&P 500 today, perhaps she decides to contribute 10% of that money every single month for the next 10 months. That way, if the market does tank in February or whatever, some of her money will benefit from that future price drop. Now, both of those definitions of dollar cost averaging share in common the idea that you're buying assets regardless of price, that you're willing to accept that sometimes you might buy high, other times you might buy low, and in the long run, it's all going to average out. Either way, you are not timing the market. That all said, we should cover an interesting piece of math and a term called lump sum investing. In short, if we look back on market history, would we be better off taking that Lynn approach of 10 deposits over 10 months? Or should we invest it all at once as soon as possible? Looking back in history, about 3/4 of the time, you would have wished you made the lump sum investment upfront. That should make sense, I think, because if we look at market history, we can easily see that it has a terrific habit of going up over time. As such, any sort of waiting to invest that we do, well, historically, it's worked against us. The market goes up, and if we're waiting, it's going up away from us. In general, if I knew that regret was not a human emotion, I would always recommend that people invest their money in a lump sum as soon as possible. But regret is a human emotion, and we must be aware of that fact, and it feels pretty bad to lump sum your investment today only for the market to go down next week. Therefore, if you're worried about investing everything at once, then dollar cost averaging can be your friend, allowing you to slowly but surely get your money into the market over time. Depending on your level of hesitancy, you could dollar cost average for months or even years. So that's how and why we should continue investing even during frothy markets like this one. because we don't know whether it's a bubble that's about to pop or simply another stair higher on a long staircase that could go on for years or decades into the future.
Hello, everyone. This is Steve Adcock. You could hear Jesse and I back on episode 91 of the Best Interest podcast. Check out my book, Millionaire Habits, for everything you need to know about how millionaires build wealth and keep wealth. Available on Amazon, Borders, Barnes & Noble, and other booksellers.
Okay, and for the final clip today, we're going to go back to episode 81. That was the very first AMA episode I did. And just to highlight some of the awesome AMA questions I've gotten in the past year or so, I wanted to share with you this question and answer where a listener wrote in and they basically said, Jesse, my portfolio has been doing great. It's also 100% invested in the S&P 500. So can you please try your best to talk me off this ledge? Why am I doing something wrong? Why do I need to diversify at all? Why do I need other asset classes? Why do I need other types of stocks? When just look at my track record, the S&P 500 is doing just fine. It's an awesome question, and I hope what I provided was a great answer to that question.
Hey, wise listeners, this is Dan Otter. You can hear Jesse and I back on episode 92 of the Best Interest podcast. And check out more teacher retirement plan talk at the Teach and Retire Rich podcast and on the website 403bwise.org.
G says, I'm close to 100% large cap stocks in my portfolio, and it's worked great for me for quite a few years now. As time has gone by, I have sold more and more of my small cap, my mid cap, my international, and I've gone all in on large cap stocks, and it's working. It's hard for me to see why this isn't a good strategy going forward. I'm close to retirement, but why should I change? So G, thanks for the question. Since you and I went back and forth via email about this, and I know a little bit about you, G, I'm going to use a unique Western New York analogy as part of my answer. So imagine I replaced the words large cap stocks in your question with Kodak. And let's say it's 1985. So you're a person in 1985 and you say, I'm close in my portfolio to being 100% in Kodak stock. And it's worked great for me for quite a few years now. As time has gone by, I've sold more and more of my other companies, my small mid-cap, my international companies, my international stocks, and I've gone all in on Kodak. And it's working. It's hard for me to see why this isn't a good strategy going forward. Now, my example sounds a little bit crazy, I know, because we're smart investors here. We would never go 100% into one single company. And of course, I've intentionally cherry-picked a company that we all know went bankrupt. But some of the underlying principles of why that Kodak statement is kind of crazy should ring true for your portfolio, G. Maybe not to the same degree, but the same underlying principles are there. You are going further and further into one single asset class, large cap stocks. So there are no bonds in your portfolio despite approaching retirement. Granted, I know as we discussed, G, and the listeners don't know this, G will be receiving a pension of some sort. And it's worth knowing that a pension serves as fixed income, which should lessen G's need for any bonds in their portfolio. But it's worth a second look to understand. I mean, you have no other diversifying assets outside of large cap stocks. You're all in on the US. There's no geographic diversification. There's no international stocks, for example. If you look at market history and when you look at what someone might consider a diversified or balanced portfolio, a lot of times you're going to see something along the lines of a 70-30 portfolio in the stock portion, meaning 70% US stocks, 30% international stocks, maybe 65-35, maybe even 60-40, 60% US stocks, 40% international stocks. And one of the reasons why is because when you zoom out, which we need to do here, when you zoom out over market history, you would see that the best risk-adjusted returns come from that mix of US and international stocks, somewhere between 60-40 and 70-30. Another thing, G, is that you're all in large cap stocks, no small caps, no medium-sized companies, just the few hundred biggest US companies and nothing else. Now, it's far, far, far from the worst asset allocation I've ever seen, but I do really think it needs some polishing, some pretty important polishing. We cannot and we should not say that the recent past has been this one specific way, and therefore I'm going to assume that the future will be that exact same way. Or using specifics here, the recent past has been most beneficial for investors in 100% large cap stocks, and therefore the future will also be most beneficial for investors in large cap stocks. It could be that way, but I highly, highly doubt it. And I don't only doubt it because it's, it's not like there's some randomization here that it's like, oh, you rolled double sixes now, and what are the odds you roll double sixes again? That's not it at all. And yes, we do need to accept that fact that we can't predict the future. And we need to accept that fact, especially in investing, that the past does not dictate the future. But there's something even more important, G, and I want to impart John Bogle's famous, what he calls the iron rule of investing. And the iron rule of investing is reversion to the mean. Reversion to the mean. Mean meaning average. Reversion meaning in time. All things tend to track back to the average in investing. No asset class can outperform forever. That's a big part of what John Bogle was saying. Asset classes, they could outperform for a year, for a few years, maybe even for a decade. But the asset classes that tend to outperform for a decade, well, they tend to underperform the next decade. And in the long run, an asset class that has a similar risk profile to one another, so say domestic stocks and international stocks, they're both equities, they have a relatively similar risk profile to one another, they will tend to have a similar reward profile to one another in the long run. Meaning when their reward profiles fall out of sync for a certain period of time, eventually they will likely revert. And we're coming off a period, to G's defense, from 2009 to basically today, May of 2024, where U.S. stocks have been crushing international stocks, specifically U.S. large cap stocks. The S&P 500 has been one of, if not the best performing equity asset classes for the last 15 years. And that's terrific. But what John Bogle has preached to us, and John Bogle's not the only one. I mean, most people who talk about diversification would agree with this idea. The idea is that nothing can outperform forever. I think I used that term before. And the fact that large cap stocks have been so good for the past 15 years, I don't think we should abandon them altogether because we can't predict the future. But it also doesn't mean that we should put all of our chips into large cap stocks. In fact, if anything, it might be time to dial down that risk. Diversification is the way. We don't know what the best performing asset classes are going to be in the next 6 months, the next 6 years, the next 60 years. We're not exactly sure. But eventually, all asset classes revert back to the mean. At least they have so far in history. Again, hard to tell what the future will hold. But this is where some basic financial planning comes into play for G. Now, I would start, G, by developing your net worth statement. Maybe you've already done that. And a 10-year projected cash flow. Maybe you've already done that. That cash flow would, if I were looking at it, it would help me understand what your outbound cash needs are from your portfolio in the short term, the next couple of years, the medium term, and eventually in the long term. And I'd want to understand questions about what you want to do with your money over the rest of your life, and even what you hope to do with your money after you pass away. Now, all of those types of input would then allow us to back into a more appropriate asset class for you. It might involve different asset classes of equities, right? Diversifying into different mid-cap, small-cap, international, those kind of things. It might involve some bonds for some fixed income. It might involve some alternatives, real estate, whatever it may be. Without knowing too much more of your story, G, I am pretty hesitant to suggest something like 100% large cap S&P 500 stocks. I understand how well it has worked for you for the past 15 years, or however long that's been your portfolio design. And one of the most challenging things in investing is this thought process that occurs when something goes really, really well for us in investing and we go, oh, we figured it out. Let's put more of our chips into that specific bet. Oh, amazing. The S&P 500 has done so well for me. I'm going to put more there and more there and more there. And if there's anything we can learn from investing history, from market history, from the wisest people involved in investing, that can be a dangerous game. Warren Buffett's pretty good at it. Warren Buffett is very famous for saying, when you find a good investment, you go all in. But what Warren Buffett is doing, the way that he's able to analyze and understand the models of specific businesses, right? Warren Buffett's very much a person who invests in specific businesses, and his analysis techniques and his patience and his mindset, his temperament is what makes him really unique. He's not the only one, right? There are many individual investors out there who have found great success with similar tactics. No offense to anybody out there listening. One thing that those investors aren't doing is writing in DIY emails to a podcast saying, hey, I've got all my chips on this bet. Tell me why I'm wrong. The idea is, if you're here listening, if you're like me, which is you're kind of a DIYer, maybe you've got that little extra expertise, diversification is your friend. It reduces the range of potential outcomes that you have. And that's really big when it comes to financial planning. if you've already won the game, so to speak, if you've put yourself in this great position in terms of your asset size as you go into retirement, and all you want to do is live that successful retirement, and you don't have to worry too much about whether your portfolio is way up or way down, you need to reduce your range of potential outcomes. And the way you do that is through diversification. The S&P 500, and maybe this will be my last point because I know I'm kind of beating it to death, but the S&P 500 is very capable of losing 20 to 40% over a couple years. It's also very capable of going up 20 to 40% over a couple years. But one thing I would hate to see happen to you, G, is to see this sudden shocking reversion to the mean over the next 6 or 12 or 18 months, where the S&P 500 essentially starts to underperform the rest of the world, or stocks drastically underperform bonds, and you're sitting there 100% into the S&P 500, and maybe you lose 30% of your net worth over the next 18 months. If you hold for the long run, maybe most of that 30% drop will recover, but it's going to be pretty hard mentally to live through that. And it's going to be pretty hard mentally to live through that knowing that you could have been in a little bit more of a balanced place. So anyway, that is the argument, or that's one of many arguments for a little bit of diversification, a little bit of balance, remembering John Bogle's lesson of reversion to the mean. Gee, since I know that we've had a conversation before, by all means, feel free to reach out to me and we can discuss it again. But I hope that answer helps you think about what you should be doing moving forward.
Hey listeners, this is Brian Feroldi. You can hear Jesse and I back on episode 74 of the Best Interest Podcast, and check out more of my financial education content at longtermmindset.co.
And with that, listeners, I want to thank you all. That's all I've got here for episode 100 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Or is it episode 1 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors? No, I think it's episode 100. But I want to thank you all. I want to thank, first off, all my guests, wonderful guests that we had on the first 99 or 100 episodes of the Best Interest Podcast. And I'm hoping many of them will come back for the next 100 episodes of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I wouldn't do this without you listeners. Thank you, listeners, again, for 100 great episodes. And hey, here's to 100 more episodes. I hope you will join us. I hope you will continue to tune in and share and learn here on Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.